Good evening. Welcome to the latest FCC Zoom talk. My name's Rebecca Bailey. Before we begin, I just want to plug another event that's happening on Tuesday at 8 a.m. That's journalist and author Fareed Zakaria, who'll be talking about his new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Marianna Spring, who is the BBC's first specialist disinformation reporter. And she's just been named in the Forbes 30 under 30 list today. So congratulations. Marianna's work humanizes the cost of misinformation and the impact of conspiracy theories, delving deep into the social media sphere. She's reported on QAnon, claims that 5G technology was helping spread coronavirus, false accusations of election fraud that led to the storming of the US Capitol, and her recent report on Panorama investigated vaccine hesitancy stoked by online conspiracy theorists. Unfortunately, that very impressive body of work has made her a target of online abuse, which spiked after she reported on QAnon, which she'll be talking about tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to our moderator, FCC Vice President Eric Wishart.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. And thank you, Marianna, for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, evening here, morning. It's afternoon there, actually. Yeah, right. But the time change, what, you're 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I think, in the UK.
1 o'clock.
Right. So you've just finished your first year as the BBC's first disinformation reporter. What have your main takeaways been from it, and have you had any surprises?
It's definitely been a very busy year, and I think that there are all sorts of things that I've learned. I really love doing this job, and I'm very lucky to work with a brilliant team of editors and experts at the BBC who investigate disinformation online. My focus has been on investigating the real world consequences, the harm that can be caused by online conspiracy theories and by disinformation that's shared on social media. And certainly it shocked me how much harm online conspiracies and disinformation can cause, particularly during this pandemic. A lot of it has posed a public health threat, and I've interviewed people who have actually lost loved ones as a consequence of falsehoods about coronavirus, whether it's real or not. I've interviewed people who've been scared off the vaccine because of tactics that are being used online in order to spread harmful conspiracies. Again, that for many will be a life or death question, a life or death decision. I've also spoken to lots of people who were impacted by conspiracies around the US election. And I'm sure from watching what happened on the 6th of January, now the world has a better understanding of how online conspiracies and extremist movements can inspire violence, real world violence, and cause serious harm. And on a more personal level, there are people I've spoken to who've had relationships destroyed, friendships ruined, marriages ending because of the impact that these conspiracy theories can have and the extent to which they can radicalize people. So I think that's been incredibly shocking. But perhaps the most important thing I've learned is how crucial reporting on this beat with empathy is. I think it's really important to try and understand why people fall victim to online conspiracy theories, to better realize the structural problems, whether that's to do with social media sites, to do with governments, to do with other things that have led us to this point, and also to be able to have productive and constructive conversations and interviews so that you really get under the skin of the issue. I think often there's a tendency to brand things bonkers and crazy, and sometimes when you're hearing some of this stuff, that might be your instinct, but actually really taking the time to speak to and investigate and understand, I think, is crucial. And by putting a human face on the impact of online conspiracy theories, I think that I hope I've been able to reach more audiences and to increase the public's understanding in the scale of this problem and the issues that it causes, particularly because social media is this integral part of all of our lives, especially because a lot of people have been stuck at home not doing very much.
And how did it come about that you got this job?
I covered social media around the UK general election at the end of 2019, investigating the impact of what was being shared on Facebook groups, disinformation, different kinds of disputes in local forums. And it was after that, doing that, and I very much tried to kind of put a human face to what was happening on social media with the team at BBC Trending. And it was after doing that that the BBC realised that having someone who did that all the time would probably be a really helpful thing. And so my job was created with a view to covering the US election. And I work with brilliant teams that already exist at the BBC, BBC Trending, at BBC Reality Check, who do fact checking, and at BBC Monitoring, who track and monitor everything that's being shared online, particularly disinformation, the team I work with. And so I came to be just a few days before the pandemic descended upon the UK. And then there was a vital need for my job investigating how disinformation about the pandemic, which very much began as much more innocent flurries of WhatsApp messages and claims that there were tanks on the streets, but soon snowballed into really harmful and quite horrible online conspiracy theories. And so there I was, ready-made to investigate everything that was going on.
How do you actually, I mean, how do you organize your day? I mean, how does a disinformation reporter work? What do you do? Do you spend half of the day on social media or speaking to people? How do you actually do it?
A lot of the reporting I do is at slightly different paces. So occasionally there'll be a huge breaking news story. A good example being what happened on the 6th of January or around the US election, or particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, there would be specific viral messages that were going really, really big. And so part of my job is the newsy part, that very responsive reporting to what's being shared online, to investigating where it's come from. Most of my time is spent working on reports that are slightly more medium term or longer term. And that involves speaking usually and meeting with, or often on Zoom at the moment, but often also going to meet people and hearing about their experiences. I receive tens of messages every single day from people who've been impacted by online conspiracy theories, whose families have, who've been affected in different ways. The Panorama investigation that I did recently was inspired by a woman called Rosemary, who got in touch with me. She's in her 80s, and she was scared off the coronavirus jab because of an anti-vaccine video that she'd been sent on WhatsApp. And so a lot of my time is spent going through those messages, responding to people, speaking to them, and trying to hear and understand their stories. Sebastian Shemirani was another example. He got in touch with me because his mum has grown a very big following online during the pandemic by promoting falsehoods, suggesting the pandemic isn't real, or that the coronavirus jabs are part of a genocide. And so I went and interviewed him very extensively and reported on that story and the impact that it had on his personal relationship. So a lot of my time is spent doing that. There are also specific stories that I'll investigate if a post gets flagged to me lots and lots of times, or I spot a specific story that's being misused. One example of this was a woman called Patricia in Texas. Her feet went viral at the end of last year because anti-vaccine activists seized upon pictures of these very inflamed feet and used them to fuel harmful narratives about the Pfizer vaccine in particular, but about coronavirus vaccines in general, suggesting that the vaccine was the cause of these sores. It actually turned out that Patricia, who had taken part in a vaccine trial, had received the placebo, and this was all over a misunderstanding that had been shared on her GoFundMe page. So I do spend time as well investigating those kinds of stories. And my favorite bit of my job is absolutely speaking to the people who've been impacted. I FaceTimed Patricia on Thanksgiving, and she was curling her hair and crying to me and telling me all about how her feet had been used to fuel this harmful narrative online. So that is the bulk of my time. And then I work collaboratively with the other teams at the BBC who are doing fact checking, who are monitoring posts online. And we have a daily meeting where we talk about what we're doing on the day, and then also what we're doing subsequently, what's to come.
So at the BBC, you have your job, but there are also fact checkers. So it's two quite distinct operations, right?
Yes.
I mean, how effective do you think fact checking is?
I think fact checking is very, very important, and my colleagues at Reality Check do a great job of fact checking everything from what politicians are saying to what's being shared online. And I think it's crucial to have that good information in a clear, accessible way that actually responds to people's questions. People want to know, is this true? And so being able to find a fact check that answers that question directly is a really, really good thing. And there are loads of great organizations like Full Facts, like others, who've been doing work on this throughout the pandemic. But I do think when it comes to reporting on this disinformation beat, on conspiracy theories online, fact checking alone is not enough, and what I do complements that. So I try and put a human face to the impact that online conspiracies have and the harm they can cause. And I hope in that way I engage perhaps people who wouldn't traditionally turn to fact checking, and can in some ways weaponize what allows disinformation to go very viral online in the first place, which is often that it's very emotive, that it plays on particular concerns that people may already have. And I think if people can hear and understand other stories, then that's a really effective way of doing that. I actually have a report coming out next week, which is all about one woman's escape from the online rabbit hole, the anti-vaccine rabbit hole. And I sat and chatted to her in the freezing cold in the south of England for a good few hours. And her story was just so insightful and interesting to understand what helped her reject these anti-vaccine conspiracy theories that she believed offline and then online. And it wasn't fact checking, interestingly. It was the cynicism, I guess, that she'd applied to the cynicism that led her down the rabbit hole was the thing that helped her out. She began to question the motives of the people who were sharing these conspiracy theories, the motives of the social media sites, and the way that they worked. And then subsequently, she turned to fact checks to better understand what she was seeing online. So I think you need a combination of all those things. And I'm really happy that the BBC does all of those things.
Could you help with some definitions? Because, I mean, we talk about fake news, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories. Can you explain, I mean, for viewers, how do you define each of these?
Yeah, so people often ask me particularly about mis and disinformation, which is, I guess, the basis of all of this. Misinformation is the broader catch-all term, and mis, we think of mistake, we think of, we kind of know what it means, which is someone sharing bad information effectively. But we don't know why. They might have done it accidentally. They might have done it on purpose. And I often find that people will forward messages on WhatsApp because they want to help other people, because they want to reach out to them and say, oh, is this going on? I don't know. Or because they want to ask questions. They're not trying to spread bad information on purpose, but they are still spreading it. Disinformation, on the other hand, is when someone is deliberately spreading bad information. And there are a committed minority of activists who continue to do this online, both anti-vaccine disinformation, disinformation about the pandemic, disinformation about elections, political disinformation. Conspiracy theories fall within that realm, but they're a little bit more complicated because they can often be very hard to disprove. When you're investigating an online conspiracy theory, for instance, the idea that Bill Gates is trying to microchip everyone and kill the world with the coronavirus vaccine, it's very hard to demonstrably show how that is false, because it's not the same as when you're fact checking something and you say, oh yeah, well, this isn't right because this is just untrue, and this person says it's untrue because of this. And so they fall into this slightly more complex bracket, but in some ways, for that reason, they are even more effective at targeting certain individuals, and people often fall victim to online conspiracies. Fake news is perhaps what came before all of this. The problem with the term fake news is that it's very much been weaponized in political spheres to target journalists, to target media organizations. And in some ways, the word disinformation is starting to become a little bit like that too. So I might need to change my title. But the issue is that while I spend a lot of my time investigating online conspiracy theories, these are terms that are weaponized by governments, by different political actors across the world. And so it does get a little bit complicated trying to understand what each one means.
I mean, I've seen sometimes the BBC's accused of fake news. How do you respond to that?
Oh, I'm accused of fake news all the time.
Not you, but the BBC. I mean, obviously, China accused the BBC of fake news over the Xinjiang reporting. So, I mean, how does the BBC defend itself against that accusation?
So when it comes to things like that, obviously the BBC's press office will deal with accusations like that, but also the team I work with did some really great research and journalism looking at the different tactics that are used by state actors, in this case China, in order to target other media organizations or other countries. And I think often understanding those tactics and how this stuff works is the best way, one of the best ways of reporting on disinformation. And they did a great piece that's on the BBC website where you can see the kind of different methods that they detail. And I think when we all understand how this works and the ecosystem in which it functions, which does include media organizations, which does include politicians, which does include celebrities and powerful people, as well as your average person, then we get a better idea of how it works and I guess how it can stop causing so much harm.
How can you fight? Let's put conspiracy theories aside just for 5 minutes. But how do you fight just your classic disinformation, misinformation spread on social media? I mean, how can people identify it, and how can they stop themselves from believing it?
So part of my job is that it's equipping people with social media literacy skills, and I do that for a range of different audiences, from people who watch Newsround, which is the BBC's news programme for children, to people who listen to Radio 4, which is one of the very established radio stations at the BBC. I think there are lots of things that people can do, and in many ways, although this is a structural problem, and I spend a lot of my time reporting, holding accountable the social media sites and governments who play a part in that, we all can do stuff to protect ourselves. I think first and foremost, if a post is very emotive, that can be a massive red flag that it's false or misleading. And so when you see something that makes you react particularly strongly, just always pause before you share it. Whenever there's a huge news event, I mean, in this case, the pandemic, but also when there are breaking news events like the blast in Beirut, we tend to see a flurry of claims and rumors and disinformation on social media. Again, sometimes innocent, but often exploited by committed activists and actors. So always question why someone had shared something and what they would gain from that. You often see that they are deliberately trying to stir up trouble or cause difficulty. It's the same when it comes to political disinformation campaigns like QAnon. And I think also just always thinking before you share, stopping, pausing. That's one of the best bits of advice I've ever been given. And telling other people if they share something, maybe they didn't mean to, that's misleading or false, or you're not sure whether it's true, have a conversation with them. And that can go much deeper. If someone you know has fallen down the rabbit hole, they're believing that the pandemic isn't real or that the jab is unsafe, try and have a conversation with them and identify often the legitimate concern or worry or fear that has led to them turning to conspiracy theories or even just sharing, quite an innocent WhatsApp with you that they think might be true and they're worried.
We talk a lot about fake news laws, and the Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, today came out and said her government is, quote, the biggest victim of fake news. And she's been talking about bringing in fake news legislation in Hong Kong. Looking at it globally, what's your verdict on fake news laws, as they're kind of generically called? And do they work? Don't they work?
Well, it obviously, starts to get into very murky territory, because this can be used as a tool by certain governments to silence individuals, to stop certain conversations. And that's where it starts to get really tricky. And I think that's one of the dilemmas that constantly faces social media sites, and is at the heart of a lot of the reporting I do, the free speech versus harm caused by disinformation and conspiracy theories. I think that there's a big difference between government criticisms of regimes, criticisms of those in power, which certainly is very understandable and not wrong, to harmful disinformation, the suggestion that the pandemic isn't real, or that a coronavirus jab is going to kill you and cause serious harm, that we can relate to direct harm to individuals. And I think when it comes to social media's policies, they've tended to started to act more and update their policies when it comes to disinformation and conspiracy theories that can cause direct harm to individuals, or even indirect harm. But I think once we start getting into the realm of government criticism, then that tips us into the censorship debate, which is a very different one. And I think, here in the UK, for instance, there's a lot of discussion about the online harms bill. And when I investigated the impact of the anti-vaccine movement online for Panorama, I asked the minister here about that bill, and that's been repeatedly delayed. But what that would do is enforce a duty of care from social media sites to the people that use those sites. And having interviewed multiple people who have come to harm, whether in their personal relationships or personally, whether they've been hurt, whether they no longer want to vote again, you can see why critics are so fierce in saying that, why has this been delayed so many times? What about all of the people who have come to harm in that interim period? And so I think that is a very different discussion to the one that we might have about censorship and how this can be weaponized. Fake news or disinformation can be weaponized in order to try and silence or stop certain individuals.
Can you explain a bit about the online harms bill? What does it actually propose?
So the online harms bill is quite complex. It's not just about disinformation. It's also about protecting children that use the internet and other things. But what effectively it would do is it would mean the government exercising more control over the social media sites than it does currently. That's something that the social media sites are not very keen on, and that's why they regulate themselves. The problem that we often find is that while they announce policies, those policies don't often equate to action. And we see how, for instance, the anti-vaccine movement has increased throughout the past year, spiked, boomed to new levels, despite the fact that there have been various policies announced to stop harmful disinformation on platforms that could be correlated to direct harm. And there are lots of different countries having conversations about this, what they should do about social media sites. It's something that's happening in the US. It's something that's happening everywhere. And it depends often on the country, I think. One thing I always notice, I recently was covering the anti-vaccine movement online in France, and a lot of the conversation there is about personal freedom to make choices over one's health, this idea of a sanitary dictatorship. And there is a real aversion to shutting down conversation, even if it's infected with harmful conspiracy theories. On the other hand, I often find in the UK that people are actually very pro those who spread harmful conspiracies being taken off social media sites. So you see how different countries' attitudes change, and perhaps their attitudes towards legislation or some kind of or more control, increased control over what's going on social media might be either accepted and welcomed warmly, or the opposite, actually rejected.
You spend, and I follow you on Twitter, obviously, you spend a lot of time talking about conspiracy theories, which really seem to be the major problem at the moment with COVID-19, and which led to the January the 6th storming of the Capitol. Also QAnon, could you explain QAnon to what is this thing? And has it reached Britain? Does the people believe it in Britain as well?
Yes, so QAnon is the baseless conspiracy theory that President Trump is waging a secret war against satanic pedophiles who are in the government, who are in media, who are in business. And it's been around since 2017. It actually was a product of the 2016 election. People might remember Pizzagate. That was this conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring in a pizza restaurant in Washington, and it actually led to a man entering that pizza restaurant with a gun. And QAnon has absolutely boomed over the past year, and not just in the US, which might interest people because it's fundamentally based around Donald Trump, the former US president. But actually, it's been very clever at rebranding itself online to try and play into certain concerns or fears of different communities and distrust that they have, often very legitimate in power and authority. It's traveled to the UK, it's traveled to Germany, it's traveled to Japan, it's all over the world, but it often repackages itself for those different locations. Here in the UK, the hashtag Save Our Children was very popular, and particularly among kind of young women or women with children, and it played on that not only a very emotive topic of kind of child abuse and trafficking and encouraging people to speak out about it, but also a distrust in authority and government, which among the different people it affected was quite understandable. So you see how conspiracy movements online are very effective at evolving. And one thing we've also seen is how QAnon has merged with, or rather sort of gobbled up, a lot of the anti-vaccine movements online, the COVID denialism or coronavirus conspiracy theories, and it all merges into one. The other issue is that once someone falls victim to one of these conspiracy networks, they tend to be very vulnerable to all of the others, and that's the real worry. And not just that, but this also merges with or is linked to far-right extremism, and it isn't that dissimilar sometimes. The difference is that someone can be scrolling on their local Facebook group or on their WhatsApp, and they start to become exposed to this again and again and again, and so they themselves journey down this rabbit hole. And one of the best things someone said to me recently was, people often think of those who believe online conspiracy theories as gullible. I mean, if you hear some of the QAnon conspiracies, there was one last year about Wayfair, the furniture company, suggesting that kids were being transported in cupboards because these cupboards had real names, and that they were being sold with pillows and all kinds of things that you just think, what? How could you believe this? But actually, I think that rather than being about gullibility, a lot of it is about people being very, very cynical. There was a man I spoke to at a protest, and he had a big placard with him saying that Bill Gates is going to microchip everyone. And I started to question him. I said, why would Bill Gates want to microchip everyone? Why would he be trying to kill everyone? I don't really understand how this plot would work, or what would be what he would gain out of it. And he just looked at me and said, you clearly think that most people are good, and I think that almost all people are bad. And I think that gives you some insight into why people believe these conspiracy theories, because they are very distrustful. It's about what they don't believe in almost as much as what they do believe in.
I think HBO just ran a 6-part series on QAnon, and QAnon gets a lot of coverage. Don't you think that the media, by amplifying it, is encouraging people to follow it?
One thing that we've definitely found, one thing that we talk about a lot in my team, and I'm sure that other reporters and teams on this beat do, is the issue of amplification, and actually what we should cover and when we should cover it and how we should cover it. When it comes to particular viral posts or particular issues, we tend to there is a bar, and once something is so viral, it's very beneficial for us to report on it. We will then do that, particularly as the BBC, which has a very wide-reaching output and website. One of the reasons that I often focus on the victims of online conspiracy theories as opposed to the people that spread them is because of that issue of amplification, and actually to be able to focus on those who experience real world harm rather than glorifying those who cause that real world harm. I think that's crucial and fundamental to my reporting. I think when it comes to QAnon absolutely reached a bar, particularly in the summer of this year and building up to the US election, where it was crucial to investigate and talk about it. I was interviewing people who said their friends might not vote because of QAnon, or that it was impacting their approaches. And I think, as we saw with what happened on January the 6th, these online conspiracy movements inspired violence and riots. And I think that if the media had not reported on those, it would not have made any difference. I think those riots would absolutely have happened, because this was all about a disinformation ecosystem that President Trump was a part of, that a number of big online groups were a part of. The Stop the Steal movement merged in with this, and so we saw this violence come about. The media was reporting on and covering this, but I think this would have happened anyways. And I did a report in the days after the election that was tracing back the deep roots of this voter fraud strategy, and you could see on Donald Trump's Twitter how he had mentioned this months and months before. And I think what's crucial is when we talk about QAnon, we often focus on this satanic paedophile bit because it's really quite bizarre. But actually, the more important bit to focus on is this idea that don't trust everything. Everything is out to get Trump. Everything is out to get you. And when you've sown those seeds of distrust, it's very easy to then come along and say, look, this isn't true. Look what's happened. And I think that is the most dangerous bit of the QAnon conspiracy. And it's what it shares in common with pandemic conspiracy theories, with those anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. It's this very, very deep distrust, but that often its roots are in nothing. There's no. They then exploit that distrust in order to promote harmful conspiracies, which the minority of actors who spread this stuff then go on to benefit from, whether it's in following, whether it's in money, whether it's in profile or otherwise.
I mean, talking about COVID and the anti-vax movement, can you explain the Disinformation dozen? This came out quite recently.
Yes, so there are 12 people who've been identified as this disinformation dozen, and they are single-handedly responsible for a lot of the disinformation about vaccines in particular, but the pandemic more broadly, that has been shared on social media. And I think this tells us a lot about how this ecosystem works. It's actually reliant on a very small number of people that are very, very committed and spread this stuff. And then you have a kind of next layer of people, and that next layer of people are the people who fall victim to this stuff and then themselves go on to spread it. And I think particularly reporting on those individuals with empathy is crucial, whereas when it comes to those initial spreaders. Those are people, a bit like when I talk about the social media sites or governments, that you want to hold accountable with your reporting. And in this, Disinformation doesn't actually feature two people who were in a video that I investigated for Panorama, which repeated a number of false claims about the vaccine, suggesting that it can change your DNA, that it's going to make you infertile, and other conspiracies, as well as some correct claims, which made it really, really hard to investigate in some ways, because not everyone was saying things that were demonstrably false or untrue, but it included false things. And it was this video that scared Rosemary, who inspired the Panorama investigation, off the jab. And I think one thing that always strikes me is that this disinformation doesn't, or this very small group of people, can affect people all over the world, and the impact and harm they can cause is absolutely massive, and social media is their tool to do that. The fact that Rosemary, sitting at home in a town in the UK called Norwich, could be scared off the jab by two people who were all the way over in the US, who she'd never heard of, who and a number of other doctors who were spread throughout the world, shows you just how quickly conspiracy theories can catch on, and the impact that they have across the world. Disinformation doesn't see borders in the same way, and it's this problem that is often presented to the social media sites, that actually it's only a small number of individuals who grow their platforms on these sites that then go on to cause a lot of harm, particularly with regards to pandemic and anti-vaccine conspiracies.
I mean, what these 12 people, I mean, they're in the US. I mean, they're not all in the US, are they?
They're predominantly US based.
Yeah. What kind of profile, and what's their motivation?
So a lot of these people are people who are historic anti-vaccine activists or holistic advocates of holistic medicine. Some of them are doctors. They have scientific qualifications, but one tactic that we've seen used a lot throughout the pandemic, and particularly with regards to the vaccine, is people brandishing their medical titles or their scientific expertise, and then going on to promote conspiracy theories or claims that are untrue. And this can be really effective because it plays in our trust in experts. We trust our doctor, we trust medical experts who are telling us things. And that's why Rosemary was so scared by this video, because it featured expert after expert after expert brandishing their title and then going on to sometimes repeat conspiracy theories about the vaccine that were untrue. A number of these people have been accused of trying to sell specific products or remedies by means of growing these big online profiles, and I think that's one of the motives for this. I think another motive is that in this influencer culture, in this age, there is a benefit to having a big following, and people often know by saying things that are particularly controversial, they can grow that following, they can grow a movement, a cult in some ways around them. I think a lot of these people, like I said, that they're not new to the pandemic. They were around before that. They were using YouTube, they were using Facebook, but they've seen the pandemic as a perfect opportunity to promote conspiracy theories about health or conspiracy theories about vaccines, which ultimately in this context can go on to cause really serious harm.
There's the real world harm caused by the conspiracy theories in that people are not getting the vaccine, they're storming the Capitol. But I mean, one thing, and you talk about that a lot, is the real world harm in relationships. And I know people who, as you call it, up and down that rabbit hole. And I mean, you mentioned Sebastian and Kate Sheramani earlier. Could you maybe talk a bit more about that? I mean, this is a mother and son, and it just destroyed their relationship, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's one of the saddest things really is I cannot overstate how much I hear from people about how conspiracy theories have ruined their relationships or led to them breaking down and fracturing in some way. I get tens of messages, and I joked quite recently that I'm a bit like the BBC's conspiracy agony aunt. I'm sort of getting back to these individuals, and all of these circumstances are very unique, but perhaps the most unique, as you say, was Sebastian Shemarani, who I interviewed in the autumn of last year. And he got in touch with me because he'd seen his mum speaking at rallies, anti-lockdown rallies, where a number of people at those rallies were then promoting conspiracy theories, and she did the same on stage, talking to people. And his mum had grown a really big following during the pandemic by promoting these falsehoods about coronavirus, about the vaccine. She's a former nurse. I've also interviewed her subsequently. But when I spoke to Sebastian, he I think one of the things that stuck with me most was a quote he said at the very end. He said, you know, soon the world will move on. Hopefully the pandemic will get easier. It will come to an end. And a lot of the people who believe these online conspiracy theories even might move on themselves, but the damage that this has caused in my family will continue. And for my mum, it will be the next thing. There will be something else that she latches onto with regards to conspiracy theories and disinformation. And what he'd found was that this had just caused a total breakdown in his relationship, so much so that he reached out to me because he wanted to speak out about it to help other people who might have experienced this in the same way, but also because he feared that his mum was posing a public health threat, that what she was saying could cause harm to people, and he could no longer just talk to her about it. He doesn't live at home, and they were still speaking, but often very difficult conversations, because he just fundamentally disagreed with her. He believed the pandemic was real. He believed that that the coronavirus vaccine was the way out of this. He believed lots of things that were very much in contrary to what the conspiracy theories that she was promoting. And this wasn't entirely new. He'd actually said that growing up, conspiracy theories were a staple in his household, and that 9/11 conspiracy theories and others to do with medicines and treatments were very much a staple feature. He said he got given a David Icke lizard book one year, and it was a really fascinating conversation that opened my eyes to the personal impact of this. And something that I'm investigating at the moment is that what happens to those individuals who've been radicalized by online conspiracy theories during the pandemic, and to the families and relationships that have been broken and affected by that. Because a lot of our conversation is about social media's policies or what governments are doing to protect users, but what about all the people that haven't been protected so far, and what happens to them now? Because there isn't really a substantial de-radicalization program. There isn't much resource put into that. And like I said, with Catherine, the woman I've interviewed who's emerged from the rabbit hole, for her it was a really complex process. It wasn't just someone saying, oh no, look, life's moved on now, you don't need to worry about vaccines, just forget about it. It doesn't really work like that. It's much more complicated. And so I think that I was very grateful for his courage speaking out about this, because after that I had tens and tens of messages and emails from people saying, this is exactly what's happening to me and my family. And
any advice, Marianna? How do you deal with the conspiracy theorists in your family?
How should you? Luckily, I was not saying I don't think I have any.
Maybe not your family, but if one has this problem, what's the? I mean, calling them crazy and stupid and insulting them is not the way forward. So what is the best approach?
I've accumulated a lot of advice from experts, from psychologists, and also from people like Sebastian who've experienced this firsthand. One of the first things that they've told me is that you should keep calm. And I found that in my experience as well. When you're interviewing someone, it's really important to keep calm and to listen. Try and understand the legitimate concern and why they've turned to this stuff. So try to get to the bottom of, are they just really critical of the government? That's totally fine, but why are they then believing that this is part of like a mass genocidal plot? Try and sort of track back and see why they've turned to these conspiracy theories. Questioning is really effective. That was something that Sebastian suggested to me, and I've again found that very effective in my interviewing, is to say to someone, okay, imagine I believe everything you're saying. How would this even work? How would anyone be capable of this? I don't understand how it would happen and why someone would do this. And that can often be very effective. Like you say, getting angry at someone and calling them silly and stupid tends to not be very effective, but it can be difficult, particularly when it's someone who's close to you. The flip side of that is when it's someone who's close to you, they tend to trust you, and they tend to perhaps not trust authority or other places that might be giving them information. And that's why they've turned to these conspiracy theories. So it's really good if you are able to use your position to help in that situation, and be patient. It might not be, it's unlikely to be a single conversation. Rather, it might be a series of conversations where you're able to start to identify what the problem is. Another thing that's really effective is to see where they're getting their information from. And if they start to show you the videos or the memes or the posts or the Facebook groups where they are getting this information, start to question and interrogate the people sharing that information. A lot of my reporting has been investigating why these people do this and the tactics they use. If you can expose the tactics and expose their motives, that also can often help someone reflect on whether they themselves are being conned by these online conspiracy movements, which is more often than not the case.
I've got a question about the sort of the political divide in the fact checking. Joshua Zimmerman's asking, great work on the anti-vax movement, but are you devoting equal time to left-wing disinformation and conspiracy theories? Because it tends to be the right-wing ones that get the most attention.
Yes, so I mean, at the BBC, you know, at the forefront of all our coverage is impartiality, and we investigate equally conspiracy movements on all sides. And for instance, when Donald Trump contracted coronavirus, there are a lot of conspiracy theories being pushed on the left side of the political spectrum from Democrats, suggesting that he didn't really have COVID and that this was all some huge conspiracy theory. And we dedicated a lot of time to investigating that. Predominantly, what drives our focus is what matters, what's big, what's making an impact. Obviously, recently that's been COVID denialism or the QAnon conspiracy, and a lot of those have tended to meddle with the right more, but that doesn't mean the left hasn't been involved. A lot of the anti-lockdown conspiracy movements that I've investigated and covered actually feature a lot of people who are on the left. It's not quite so simple, I guess, in terms of the political divide. I think perhaps in the US it's different. In the UK, there's actually a mixture of different people, particularly the committed activists who spread this stuff, anti-vaccine or otherwise, who are from across the political spectrum. And so my job is to investigate the people who are doing that, regardless of what their political inclination is.
I think it was when you started investigating QAnon that the online violence, which is what we call it now, exploded against you. Can you talk about that and the kind of what you've been facing online?
Yeah, so it was in the sort of early summer of last year. I was covering that Wayfair story, actually, the one I mentioned about children being shipped in cupboards, which was just not true. And I did some lives, which I do a lot. I do broadcast TV, radio, and online. And I remember very well sitting outside with a friend, having a pizza, having a beer, I think. And all of a sudden I looked at my phone and it had just absolutely exploded. And I had so many messages and I thought, what on earth has happened? And I soon realized I was experiencing my first QAnon pile-on, and it was, you know, message after message. You're a satanic pedophile, you evil bitch, you're horrible, you're trying to kill the children, all of this kinds of stuff. You eat babies, which to me just seemed totally detached from my sitting there with my friend in the UK on the common eating a pizza. I sort of didn't know what to do. And I remember calling up my editor and he said, look, you know, block them if it's really overwhelming, if they keep going. And one thing I found is that a lot of the big influencers would then they'd quote your tweet and then it would be sort of piled on again by more people. And that's been a pattern of behavior I've noticed throughout the pandemic. This committed minority who've grown big followings will target you. They will deliberately send their followers to you. And whenever this happens, I receive a lot of abuse. David Icke, for instance, frequently posts memes of me referring to me as a child, and a lot of the abuse I receive is very much misogynistic in its nature. It focuses on me being a little girl, or it focuses on me being Satan's whore. I think when it comes to the kind of you eat babies, it's quite easy to detach from that. I also get a lot of anti-BBC abuse. You know, BBC's specialist disinformation reporter, haha, no, you're a psyop, you studied Russian at university, you must be a spy, all of this kinds of stuff. And it's become increasingly horrible as time has gone on, particularly as my profile has grown, and the more reporting I do, the more abuse that I receive. Obviously, the vast majority of messages I receive are really, really positive, and it's brilliant to see the impact that my reporting has, and to hear from lots of people who really appreciate it, who've been personally affected by these kinds of issues. But this committed minority are very, very committed, and they really don't stop. And a lot of that has escalated into threats. And when the Panorama investigation aired recently, I had to escalate some of those threats to the police. There have been some quite scary incidents involving my personal safety. And the BBC has a great team that look at, that monitor your social media mentions and what you're receiving, but that also that account for your personal safety. And I'm very lucky to have an editor who really understands this topic. is very passionate about it and very, very supportive, and a team of editors who do that. But that doesn't necessarily make it easy. And one thing I find myself saying a lot is, I really love doing my job, but I really don't like getting horrible abuse online very much.
Rebecca, you wanted to follow
Yeah.
up?
Yeah, I mean, Marianna and I used to work together at the BBC, and yeah, you've been doing such great stuff. And I saw you were doing a Trust in News conference, a BBC Trust in News conference recently, and you said in it that you were worried about becoming desensitized to the abuse you get. And I just wondered if you could explain that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I do worry in some ways that I have become really desensitized. I think because you learn to kind of put up with it, to cope with it, and obviously, you report things to the social media sites, and you escalate things further within the BBC and to the police and otherwise. But I do think that you often also become very you don't read all of it, you don't engage with a lot of it, and that can often mean that you start to think, yeah, I always find it really interesting when I'm talking to one of my friends who's not a journalist, or even when I'm talking to researchers looking into this topic, and I'm actually working on an investigation into this at the moment, and I start to tell the stories of different things that have happened, like a man made a very creepy blog about me that was, thousands of words long with phenomenal amount of detail about me and pictures that are featured on my Twitter, or scary incidents involving my safety, stuff to do with walking home, stuff to do with, really quite scary things. And you start to go through them and you think, oh God, that was really bad. Oh, and that was really bad. And then you realize the accumulative effect. But when you're enduring each and every incident, you perhaps don't notice that so much. And I'm always amazed when people will receive things, perhaps from my team or more broadly, and they're like, God, this is awful. And I think, oh, I get like 10 of those a day. And then you start to realize that this is, totally not normal and not okay. I'll frequently receive messages saying you should be hanged, you're complicit in the genocide, you should be dead. A lot of it's very, very misogynistic, everything from slut to whore to goodness knows. And I think that it's a huge problem. In some ways, I think I'm quite lucky because I am able, since this is part of the beat that I report on, I am able to actually investigate this. I'm able to, like I say, I'm working on an investigation into this right now. I'm able to report on it. There are lots of other female journalists across the world who receive horrific abuse and can't do that. There are also lots of journalists who receive horrible abuse for who they are, whether it's racist, homophobic, they're persecuted just for doing their jobs in the countries they work in. That I think what I experience pales in comparison to that. But I think what I experience is very unique, and something that newsrooms are definitely learning more about, that reporting on this very committed minority of activists who spread disinformation or spread conspiracy theories online is a bit like sort of prodding a bee's hive, that you get an awful lot of abuse that's very unique in its nature.
I was going to ask, because I mean, you were 24 when you were appointed to this role. I mean, do you think the BBC and even you yourself, to an extent, had any idea what you were letting yourself in for?
I think in some ways, so my editor, who's brilliant, but I don't think he's on there, called Mike Wendling, is very experienced in covering QAnon, and he actually has written a book about it. And so he himself has firsthand experienced, really scary threats and abuse sent to him and his family. And so I think in some ways that geared us up quite well for what was coming, particularly because he oversaw my job. And I think he gave me a pretty good idea of the kinds of abuse I could be subject to, and has been there sort of throughout, not holding my hand, but feeling very well supported. And I think that's absolutely crucial in being able to handle this kind of thing. I think for the broader kind of BBC, a lot of it comes as quite of a shock, just because we're not all, we don't all spend our time with our heads in these conspiracy movements investigating what's going on online. And so to see one of your correspondents receiving messages saying they're a satanic paedophile who eats babies is quite shocking. They're like, what? Why is anyone sending you this kind of thing? So I think that's, for that reason, it's absolutely vital in newsrooms that you do have specialist teams that really understand certain areas. And the rest of my team also also receive abuse, and they really get it, and I think that's massively helpful. And I think as time goes on, this is one of those beats where people will better understand its implications. I do think as well, women, I mean, a lot of the female reporters and correspondents in the US who report on this receive horrific abuse, and I think in some ways the abuse I receive is not quite as bad because of the landscape in the UK, but nonetheless, particularly for women, and I notice the contrast between me and other male colleagues is huge. I repeatedly receive abuse that's about how I look, that's about being a woman, being young. That's a bit of one of their obsessions as well. And so I think, as well as I think we've all learned a lot about the kind of abuse that is sent to reporters on this beat and how better to tackle it. And one thing I often find is that the onus tends to be on the individual to report abuse, to flag it higher up. And so having systems that take that onus off, particularly I think women journalists, is a really good thing, because it's not our responsibility to if someone's sending you horrible abuse, it's not your job to have to then, you don't need to foot the emotional bill for what they're doing. And so, yeah, I think it's something that people are learning a lot about. And I'm really lucky to have been very, very well supported, not just in my team, but by, lots of really senior bosses at the BBC who absolutely want to do everything they can to protect their reporters, and have done a lot to do that. And I think also talking about it's really helpful, even talking about it now, so that more people realize that this is a problem, and, you can love doing your job, or you can whatever, but people shouldn't really have to tolerate this level of abuse.
And sorry. And sorry, you said you'd escalated a couple of these complaints to the police. What was your experience of that? How well set up is the UK police to deal with online complaints?
I think it's a big problem, and it's kind of part of the reason that I'm investigating it, that I think particularly when it comes to this kind of stuff, and abuse around conspiracy theories and disinformation, it is often also totally alien to the police, and they think, oh, why are you being called a satanic paedophile eater? I don't understand. They were very helpful, and I think one really positive thing is that there's been an announcement made about new plans to dedicate liaison officers in police forces in the UK to deal with abuse that journalists receive in particular, and that's a really welcome thing, and something I'm really happy has come about. It's a kind of a collaborative effort from the BBC, but also from other news organisations working with government departments and otherwise. That tends to be an issue. I think that also one of the big problems, and that's one we always talk about with online abuse, is that people don't necessarily make themselves very easily identifiable online. And so being able to find those people and hold them accountable is very difficult, and there's not necessarily the resource to do that. And often we can find that individuals, I know my editor found a man who was sending me horrible death threats in the US and reported him to his I think it was the kind of local police department of his town, who said, oh, we know this guy, we'll go and speak to him. So, my editor does that quite a lot. Often will actually engage with these people sort of on my behalf, which I think is often very effective, because people suddenly realize, oh, whoa, someone actually read what I wrote and it was really horrible. And it's now a bit scary because their editor's saying, why did you send my reporter a death threat? So I think that's actually a very effective way of doing this as well. But obviously, a lot of these messages are in breach of the Malicious Communications Act here in the UK. A lot of them are also in breach of social media guidelines, but yet they remain, and there are no arrests, and the messages are still very much there.
And I mean, this is a recurring theme, Marianna. I mean, we've had Maria Resser on. We had a panel a couple of weeks ago on anti-Asian hate in America, where the speakers have been subject to this as well. I mean, isn't it time there was some sort of concerted effort to fight this, particularly against women online? I think this recent UNESCO poll showed that 75% of women journalists had suffered some form of online abuse, and it also has turned into real world harm attacks. I mean, what responsibility do the platforms have? What should they be doing about this?
I think it's an issue that's highlighted again and again, and one that I've highlighted in my own reporting. I reported on Gina Miller, the political activist in the UK, and abuse she'd received, and actually introduced her to one of the trolls who'd sent her abuse, and they struck up this very poignant and unlikely friendship because they realised they had much more in common than they thought. And I also reported on an anti-racism protester who received horrific racist abuse online from often far-right groups on Facebook, and that abuse to this day, it was based on false claims made about him setting fire to a flag, which he didn't, and a photo where he was falsely identified as the individual featured. But those posts were never removed from Twitter, despite rallies from footballers here in the UK and others to remove them. And so I think there is a big problem, even beyond journalism, about removing even beyond the experience of journalists, about removing online abuse, and about how well platforms enforce their policies, and how those who send abuse are also very clever, a bit like when it comes to conspiracy theories, at getting round the issues and actually being able to say, oh, I'm going to put something which actually isn't technically breaching any of their rules. I'm not saying anything that vulgar and that horrible, but the nuance is that, oh, it's actually not very nice. And I think when you have algorithms checking things as opposed to real people, that can mean those posts very much stay. I think when it comes to female journalists, it's absolutely a huge problem. And I was delighted to be able to speak to UNESCO recently for a research project. They are doing all about this, about abuse that women journalists receive across the world and why they receive it. And that's coming out in, I think, May or June time, which will be really interesting and good insight into the abuse that women receive online and the different kinds of abuse that women receive online. It's something, like I say, that I'm working on a project on at the moment. And I think that at least this conversation about online abuse is absolutely sort of it's increasing. More people are talking about it in different realms, whether we're talking about racist abuse received by footballers, abuse received by people on reality television or otherwise, or journalists just for doing their jobs. I think that conversation is very much happening, and as a consequence of that conversation, investigations and hard-hitting reports are absolutely crucial so that people can better understand this issue, and those who are at fault here, whether it's the individuals or the structures that allow this to happen, can be held accountable. So it's definitely something that I'd love to talk to you again about in future, hopefully when my report comes out about it.
Absolutely. We'd like to invite you back to, I think we should have a panel discussion, an international panel discussion, because this is just a global crisis. And I still feel that platforms haven't taken it seriously. You wouldn't allow this in the offline world. And so I think they have to recognize it's not acceptable in the online world. Coming back to Britain and the tabloid press, I have a question from Peter Bozar. The British tabloids are famous for promoting conspiracy theories and sensationalizing isolated facts to sell newspapers. Where do you fit them into the fake news landscape? I mean, if you looked at the Brexit campaign, it was so much anti-Islamophobic, anti-migrant stories in the front page. They're cancelling Christmas, all this stuff. I mean, the tabloids do have this history. I mean, what do you think of the British tabloid press and where it is situated regarding the whole fake news phenomenon?
The media definitely plays a role in this online disinformation ecosystem, and I guess specifically what I focus on is what happens on social media, what happens on the internet. And absolutely, links are shared, used to fuel disinformation. You can scroll through a Facebook group and a lot of the links will be to legitimate news sites, not just to kind of those slightly more outlandish blog posts or memes or YouTube channels. I do think, though, that when it comes to the press and the media in general, whether that's broadcasters or print, are held accountable in a different way to those people that publish on social media. And that does play a role here. Obviously, you're right to point out that the media is absolutely part of that landscape. But one thing we find, for instance, is that committed activists who are spreading really harmful conspiracy theories will use articles from the tabloid press or from the press in general to fuel their harmful narratives that aren't necessarily what the article was saying in the first place. And I think that is the fundamental difference between those kind of activists who spread this stuff online unchecked and then the you know, the newspapers that will or can be sued when they do post certain things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those systems of accountability are working, but they do absolutely exist in a way that they just don't really exist in the same way for, you know, the same, like you say, the disinformation dozen, or the same people that go about spreading this stuff again and again. But absolutely, you know, politicians, the media, and celebrities and influencers online, some of those conspiracy influencers and some of those mainstream kind of celebrities are often named as the super spreaders when it comes to, you know, conspiracy theories and mistruths, often because they have big audiences. So absolutely, my job is reporting on how that ecosystem works and fits, and who's accountable for what.
I mean, how many people are doing what you're doing in Britain? I mean, in the United States, and there are a lot of people covering disinformation. Obviously, Craig Silverman in Canada for BuzzFeed does fantastic work. How many people doing it in the UK?
No, they're not really. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that the BBC has a specialist disinformation reporter and a team that do this, because like you say, BuzzFeed, NBC, New York Times all have brilliant correspondents on this beat. But most of the UK broadcasters and newspapers don't have dedicated reporters. Some do, and increasingly do. At The Independent, at The Eye, at some other news outlets, they are having people who are dedicated to this beat, but it's still much smaller. And I think it's a really good thing that the BBC has this team that is pioneering this area and covering it, and not just for UK audiences either, but all over the world. I mean, BBC Trending at the moment, which is part of the disinformation team, has a series called the Anti-Vaxx Files on the World Service that people can tune into, and that's for everyone all over the world, and it's exploring the impact of the anti-vaccine movement everywhere. There are great legions of fact checkers all over the world, definitely, increasingly so in Africa and Asia, in Europe as well. But I think absolutely having disinformation correspondents and reporters who investigate the impact of online conspiracy theories and cover this beat, it's huge, and people sometimes don't realize what a massive beat it is. And I have no doubt that I will be investigating conspiracy theories on social media and the harm that they cause and the impact of bad things on the internet for a very long time to come.
Yeah, I don't think you're not going to run out of conspiracy theories to write about. So, Marianna, just to finish, and again, thanks very much, very insightful talk. We always ask our guests, what books are you, or books are you reading, and do you have any you would recommend? It doesn't have to be about fake news and disinformation. So,
well, I get asked this a lot, mainly because people want to read things about fake news and disinformation. I mean, all of the books by Peter Pomerantsev are brilliant, really, really worth reading. One of my favorite books I've read recently is Emily Maitlis's Airhead, which I think gives you a really nice insight into what it's like being a journalist, and humanizes the experiences that you have with the people you interview and the interactions. And I find that's one of my favorite things about giving talks like this, or being able to write about my job, not just for the BBC, is that I can give those little anecdotes, like the man who told me he doesn't trust anyone, and I think that tells us so much more often than even just the reporting itself. So that is a really good book I'd recommend. Yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else, but I don't think I can think of another one.
That's good. Thank you. So thanks very much. I mean, I think we would like to invite you back later in the year to follow up on this very important discussion about the online abuse and harassment. And so pending that, I mean, good luck with the work. And I mean, I just find it appalling that you and other journalists have to face this online abuse. But I mean, I think that was a good piece of recognition from Forbes today. So thank you for fighting. I know you're very busy with all of this, so I would just like to thank you again on behalf of the FCC.
Thank you for having me. It was brilliant to talk to you.
Thank you. Good night, and good night, everybody.